The more the media and government's trying to get you to pay attention to something, the less you should care about that thing. And then vice versa. The more they're trying to deflect from something, that's what you should probably be looking at. Because it's all a game of magician's patter.
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. Today we have a special guest, former director for the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation at the United States Agency for International Development, Mark Moyar. That is a mouthful. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. So let's get right into it. You are, tell me where you grew up before we get into all this stuff.
Well, I grew up in near Cleveland, Ohio, in the suburbs, and talk a little bit in the book about growing up in a very liberal suburb. But I now live in Michigan, teach at Hillsdale College here, and used to hate Michigan living in Ohio, but now realize it's a pretty nice place.
Do you still hate the University of Michigan, though?
Well, I have mixed feelings. I kind of started cheering for them when they lost like 10 games in a row and wanted to have a rivalry. But yeah, I tend to cheer for Ohio State still.
I think Ohio State's going to be fine this year. It seems like they're probably better this year.
Yeah, I think that's right.
We'll see. So what was it like growing up in, I guess, the Midwest? Cleveland is one of the older cities in the Midwest, so it's not, it's, there is some infrastructure there, I guess. So how was it like, or how was it growing up there?
Well, it was already a bit of a city in industrial decline, but it was Midwest. People generally pretty pleasant. The suburb where I lived, Shaker Heights, was known for being the most liberal. And so there were very few Republicans. Actually, in the book, I tell the story about how we had a mock election in our school in 1980 when I was 9 years old. And everybody voted for Jimmy Carter, and nobody even knew who Ronald Reagan was. And he actually finished third behind John Anderson in this student mock poll. So when you're a kid growing up and you think everybody votes the same way, unfortunately, we still have people in this country who assume that if you don't vote a certain way, there's something wrong with you. It wasn't as bad as the Northeast. Certainly, I lived in the Northeast for a while, where I think the liberal intolerance is even more severe. But I do like the Midwest in general. People are more nice to each other, a little more laid back, and they don't tend to be as angry at people who hold different views than their own.
Yeah, it seems like the Midwest is a little bit less interested in politics and more interested in the traditional view of Americans in politics, which is, how's my wallet doing, for the most part, right? The misery index usually has been a pretty good indicator of how that part of the country is going to vote. It's been different lately, I suppose, but lately, or historically, it's mostly been pretty traditional there. I worked on, I don't know if you recall the recall of Scott Walker back in the day. I kind of worked on that campaign, on some of those campaigns a little bit, and it was interesting. Nobody was talking about anything that had any grounding in reality at all. And this was 2012, I think. So, 12 years ago, because people think of the political divide in the United States really growing a lot in the last 10 years or so, or maybe even since Trump in the last 8 years. But I think it started quite a bit before that.
Yes, and the Midwest has certainly been hit very hard by the migration of industrial jobs out of the country. And so I think that's done a good bit to change the dynamic. And Trump was really the only one in 2016 who was talking about this issue. But if you go to the Midwest and see all these towns where all the factories are closed, and you start to understand why people are doing what they say. And now we also have, thanks to Biden's border policy, you have the millions of people coming into the country illegally, and some of them are coming into the Midwest. They're not just in the border states, and so that's affecting people here as well.
Boy, yeah, the border. I mean, we live in Texas, so it's been pretty obvious to us for a long time what's going on here. I think the past 2 years has made it kind of obvious to other people. I wonder, from your perspective, how much do you think this election in 24 is going to hinge on the immigration policy of Biden over the past couple of years?
I do think it could be the deciding issue because you see a lot of people who maybe were on the fence before they've seen what Biden is. I think Biden had a chance to govern closer to the center, but instead he chose to go with the far left policy on immigration. And there's a recent poll that said 62% of Americans want to deport all of the illegals, not just some of them, but all of them. So there's a massive public backlash across the board in various, every ethnic and racial group. This is sucking away money from other government programs. And of course, we're seeing crimes committed, people being murdered. Biden is now trying to, very late in the day, try to do some of these executive orders, which he previously said he couldn't. But I tend to think it's going to be a little too late for Biden.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obama did the same thing when he first came into office. He waived every immigration law that we had, essentially, right? I was actually towards the end of his second term, I was working at USCIS in the fraud detection department, and excuse me. But he seemed to figure it out pretty quick. I think the first 18 months or so were pretty chaotic border-wise, and then you remember all the kids in cages stuff. Well, those were institutions that he built with Hillary Clinton as the border czar. I don't know that people seem to have memory hold that whole thing, right? But he did deport more people than all previous presidents combined, right? All previous combined, not his predecessor, and did so not with Congress, just by edict, in the same way that Trump did when he entered office, to a greater degree. And obviously, the border policy wasn't much of an issue on when Obama was on the way out. So he kind of loosened things up, and that's why I ended up leaving USCIS, because no matter what we sent to ICE, no matter what cases we sent there, they were just like, yeah, we can't prosecute this. They won't let us. I'm like, all right, cool. Well, I don't really have a job then, do I? I'm just collecting a paycheck, and that's not great. But he seemed to figure it out. Like, he at least adjusted course. I know Biden isn't in any way cognitively aware of what's going on around him, but you would think that the people who have been active bureaucrats for, decades now would have figured out, like, we're risking a lot by letting this happen. So there must be, when somebody takes a great risk like that, they think or believe that there's a great reward on the other side. What do you think the reward is for all this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think they certainly see that these are people who are going to be Democratic voters. The question is, how soon can they do it? Can they actually vote in the next election? That's going to be tougher for them to do. But we know they're losing support among, even among blacks and Hispanics. So they need more voters, and no better way to get voters and to bring people in who are going to depend on government support for a long, if not indefinite, period of time. So I think they see this as helping the Democratic Party. Again, it may take time for some of these people to get the ability to vote, and of course, they say they're going to show up in court eventually, and then they'll have to leave. But we think they've looked at things and know how hard it is to actually get these people out of the country once they're here.
Well, in addition to that, about 60% of people don't show up to their NTA hearing in the first place, right? And it doesn't help that we subsidize their movement throughout the country, give them a check and a plane ticket. It's like, all right, cool. Well, now they're just going to go operate in a parallel economy somewhere inside the country without any kind of, like, they're not paying taxes and shit.
Yeah, and they're driving down the wages for everybody else in the process of all that. It's really
odd how costs haven't come down commensurate with all this wage deflation, right? I mean, that's always the selling point for migrant labor, is like, oh, that'll bring costs down. It keeps our fruit cheap. It keeps our commercial goods cheap. Well, okay, where's that happening exactly? Because it's not at my grocery store.
Right, and that's the thing. Another reason why Biden is going to lose, because people in the working class who have to spend a lot of their money on food have seen prices have gone way up. They went up during COVID and they never came down. Well, wages went up a little bit, but but most people can't buy what they bought before, and that for a lot of people, if you can't get enough food on the table under Biden, and you were able to do it under Trump, I think that's going to drive a lot of people's behavior in November.
For sure, yeah. Now, this is all just standard politics, but your expertise is in history and military history. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
Okay, well, I love that. So, tell me about your education in this. Well, first, tell me why you decided to go into this because your undergrad is from Harvard in history. Is that correct? Or
Yeah.
it's a concentration. I know. We're not going to
Yeah.
get uppity about Harvard here. God damn it.
Uh-huh.
So studied history, and then when did you get into military history and why?
Well, I started getting into it during college. I took a course on the Vietnam War in college, and I started to realize, and I'd met some Vietnam vets before, I should say, it seemed like what was being taught in college was pretty divorced from reality. And so I really took a strong interest in Vietnam. Previously been more of a World War II kind of guy, as a lot of young men are, but got into Vietnam, then did a first book came out in 1997. I thought I was going to go into business, in fact, but ended up going back to get a PhD, although I did it warily because I know, even then academia tilted very far left. And so very hard to get a position as a professor if you are plainly seen as being right of
Hmm.
center. So I ended up from there, after getting the PhD, I went and taught the U.S. Marine Corps University in Quantico for 6 years.
You did your PhD at, in Cambridge. Is that correct?
I did, yeah. Which the UK system has a number of advantages. The PhD programs are shorter, and also their academic departments are not as political. They kind of lean left, but they're not in the business of saying, "Oh, well, I care more about your political opinions than how good of a scholar you are." So
Sure.
it was a nice place to study.
Sure. I mean, so just for anybody that hasn't done graduate or postgraduate work, you have to have a sponsor, right? So somebody
Mhm.
has to, at some point, accept your thesis, and I think that might be more difficult if you're not toeing the line here in an Ivy League school in the United States, at least. I mean, they won't even admit what a woman is or if Hamas is good or bad, right? So certainly they're not going to support somebody who's taken a different take on, I guess. We were technically still in containment during Vietnam, I think, but it was trending towards détente. So, yeah, what was it? What was the difference? The big key difference you felt from your graduate work in the States versus Cambridge?
Well, there was less political pressure to conform in Cambridge. Vietnam also was not as much of an issue to them, but much of the American professoriate was actually engaged in the left wing anti war movement during Vietnam, and so I was essentially challenging the fundamental tenets that they had built their case on, and they were, in my view, basically twisting history to try to justify why they protested against the war and why they avoided the draft.
Okay, and you've written quite a few historical articles for major publications on, I guess, on what could be considered both sides of the political aisle. Washington Post on one side, though it may not have been as left back then, and then Wall Street
Mm-hmm.
Journal, which is, I think Wall Street Journal has been more or less centrist, maybe conservative on the economic side, but more or less centrist on most stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought, I want to run this by you since you've worked in the industry for a while. It's always been my opinion that Walter Cronkite created a lot of this bullshit that we see in modern media. I know that cable news contributed to it and sponsorships and things like that as well. But I think Walter Cronkite taking an open position on Vietnam as a newsman was a mistake, and I think it paved the way for everybody else since him to do that. Pretty much. I mean, you don't see there's no such thing as centrism in news anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And I talk about Cronkite actually in my most recent book on Vietnam. In 1968, after the Tet Offensive, he comes out and is very dismissive of the American war effort. And he says, I don't know that it's worth trying to keep winning this war. What we need to do is negotiate a settlement, but he never really said what exactly that meant. And there was, for a long time, for him and many others, this naivety that, well, we can come with to some reasonable sort of compromise with the
Mm.
communists. But as we eventually found out, when we finally did strike a deal, they never intended to honor it. So, Cronkite wasn't telling people that the options are either we stay here or we capitulate. He was claiming we could find some sort of middle road, which ended up not existing. It's also interesting to look at, and I only came across this fairly recently, but Cronkite later became a big advocate for an idea of having some sort of world government. If you Google online, you
Mm.
can actually find videos of him talking about this rather crazy idea that we're going to give up our national sovereignty so that some global entity is going to govern us.
Yeah. Well, with all due respect, fuck that. I think everybody would agree that's listening to this, probably, unless there's some strays running around, but not interested in any way in that. I mean, I don't even like our own government, much less a bigger one that's farther away, right? Didn't we fight a war about that shit? Yeah, that seems wild to me. Have you paid a lot of attention to the proliferation of this globalist movement over the past, let's call it 60 years or so? Because you see bits and pieces here and there, and it's become quite a bit more obvious lately because they're just saying everything out loud. But it feels like it's existed for quite a bit longer than we've been aware of it.
Yeah, so you have a global affluent elite that for decades now, it spends more time interacting with each other than with people in their own countries. And so they've lost sight of what's actually going on in the world. So they have these crazy notions about how we can just all get together and we'll have some elite technocrats who will tell all of these, ignorant people everywhere else what to do. And, I think the rise of Donald Trump indicated how people, certainly in this country, have figured out that there's this elite class that's disconnected from them, and that we certainly don't want them running things from some other country. But even within our own country, we're seeing this uh, government that's out of touch. So, I mean, I think the farther away government is, the less responsive it is. So, the more that's you can do at your local level and state level, the better. And but we've also seen that federal government has gotten larger, and that's one of, I think, the problems too that Trump and other Republicans have seen, is that people thought this big federal government was going to work in everyone's interests, and instead, too often, it works in its own interests.
Yeah, I mean, to the globalism thing, it seems like this, whatever it is, this I don't want to call it a cabal because I don't think that's the case, but the global elite, affluent, whatever patricians, it seems like it's just the Roman Senate again, and they're presiding over all the established nations and pillaging the developing ones, pretty much just like what Rome did, right? In the first 2 centuries BC and then the first century AD. And we talk about a lot about America being the Roman Empire, rise and fall, where we are in that period. But it might be that that the world is the Roman Empire now. We're just going through those processes on a global scale, right? I think it might be better to look at it that way because then you can get a better sense of who the players are, right? Because some of these alliances between people don't make a lot of sense. A guy like Elon Musk, for example, who calls himself a free speech absolutist and wants to do all of these things, is still very cozy with Indonesia and China and Turkey and these places that are despotic regimes, and capitulates to them on a regular basis, including allowing censorship on his platform, right? Because he needs lithium and cobalt. Frankly, that's really what it is. But that's no different than any of these other deals with the devil that we've made throughout history. So I wonder, from your perspective, does that make any sense? Because you know these things. Does it make sense that the Senate isn't just the political class in America, but it's something quite a bit larger?
Yeah, well, I think there is this, um, and I think these people, at least initially, believed it sincerely that the world would all be better off if we just got rid of borders and trade barriers, and it would lift all boats. Clearly, seeing that it hasn't worked out that way, especially for the American worker, because China has rigged the system. It manipulates its currency. It sets up barriers to our products, but then dumps cheap things here. And again, if you're living in New York or Beverly Hills in a big mansion, these things aren't affecting you. You're still making lots of money. You probably invest in companies that profit by going overseas to these cheap places in the short term. I think in the long term, we are you know, decimating our ability to defend ourselves by allowing all this industry to leave our country. But in the short term, these people are making a lot of money while the wages of the rest of the country are stagnant or even going down. And I think Trump was a bit of a shock to some of these people, but we just had European elections last week where the nationalist parties got very large majorities in pushing out the left. So we're seeing, I think, across the world, people in many of these countries now coming to realize that these global elites don't have their best interests in mind. And it's going to be interesting to see exactly how this plays out. But I think this is also another reason why Trump is very well positioned, because American people are still unhappy with how this free trade and open borders policy is actually hurting them not helping them.
Yeah, it's interesting how the Overton window moves around and political classes change and stuff like that, because these arguments we're hearing now about globalism are very similar to the ones I remember from my childhood about NAFTA and how it was going to decrease union labor. But this is a left issue back then, right? It's going to
Right.
decrease skilled labor costs, or I'm sorry, wages and stuff like that. Um, and they also made the case about border security back then. Oh, it's going to interrupt or it's going to interfere with our border security. I don't think they ever gave a shit about that. They just cared about union jobs because unions give them so much money to run for office. But um, yeah, it's really interesting to see how, if you look over the past 100 years or so, you can see either party making the identical argument depending on if it's politically expedient for them or not. And it seems to me like I don't really care about political parties and stuff like that. I just care about principles. That's what matters. So if you just stay in the same place, your political party is going to change every 25 years, right? That is what does that tell you? Like, how am I as a normal citizen voter supposed to respond to that kind of information?
Yeah, well, that's tricky. You're right. The issue of tariffs, free trade was it was the Democrats until a few decades ago
Hmm.
who were in favor of that. But I think partly they dug their own grave because so much of the industrial working class has been decimated, and so you don't have the same unions now. Their big unions are public sector work unions or hospitality industry unions, but a lot of the other working class Americans are they've now shifted to Trump because the Democratic Party doesn't have much to offer them, and Democrats are certainly playing this issue of the poor and minorities and trying to hype that up without I think too much thought really about how they're shifting their principles on some of these issues. But yeah, certainly individual needs to keep in mind that the different issues that matter most to them and kind of assess the candidates that way. I do think we have seen a decline in interest in some of the parties per se, and partly because they seem to shift their positions on a lot of these issues. But I think Biden, probably the last election, he benefited from the abortion issue. I mean, I was in Virginia at that time, and that's all the left-wing media was trying to push. I'm not sure that will work as well this time. So the immigration issue and the economy, I think people are going to be looking at those issues more when they are deciding which candidate here they are going to vote for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean it all seems like convenient alarm bells every couple of years, to be honest. One of one of the things I like to tell people is like the more the media and government's trying to get you to pay attention to something, the less you should care about that thing. And then vice versa, the more they're trying to deflect from something, that's what you should probably be looking at, because it's all a game of magician's patter. If you Let me ask you this: if you could change one thing about our current federal system, what would you change?
I would change the rules about firing and removing career bureaucrats, because that's a lot of what the book is about. That you have these bureaucrats who are in power, and uh, most of them you can't fire because of union protections, and so uh, for one thing, they can resist what you're trying to do, and they have a lot of creative ways, so it doesn't seem like obvious resistance. But if you're a political appointee, you eventually figure out over time that some of this is happening. Uh, but also, just in general, if you want to reduce the size of government, you think the federal government's got too big. It's very hard to shrink it because these people have protected jobs. So I think that's the single most important thing that can be done.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny you say that because my chief, or sorry, not my chief, but my direct boss at USCIS, he told me that he's like, this is the story of how the federal government works. Congress, some committee in Congress decides that we need to do X, and then they send it over to personnel, and personnel decides, OPM, they decide, well, we need Y number of people to do this job. Okay, cool. So they hire Y number of people for the next fiscal year, and let's say it's four people, and it turns out that two of them are total pieces of shit, right? But you don't get evaluated every couple of months and then fired. You just exist. So now you have two people and the work doesn't get done. They're like, oh, I guess it took six people to do this. So they hire two more people to do the job, and one of those guys sucks, right? So now you've got three people. You have six people doing the work of three people, still not getting the job done. And this is how government bloat gets created. And the federal employee union, FEU, makes it notoriously difficult, as you mentioned, to fire any of these people after one full year of service, which is like there's a probationary period. But as soon as that's over, it's very difficult to fire these people. So now we have systemic bloat that's not going to change, right? If you want anything to get done at the federal level, you have to just keep hiring turds, basically, like just completely useless people.
Yeah, and one of the things too I learned more from being inside the government as a federal executive is that people in government tend to get paid and promoted based on how many people they manage and how much money they manage. So they have an automatic incentive to want more people, because if they say, I need another 20 people, I was managing 50, now I'm up to 70, but if I'm managing 70 people, it must mean I'm more important, more powerful. So you have these, awful incentives for people to claim they need more when they don't. And I've seen also, I worked for a time at Joint Special Operations University in Tampa, Florida, and it was well known. People said typically you could cut half the staff at this headquarters of Special Operations Command, and you would see no decline in effectiveness, because about half of them basically were not doing anything useful. But then they would go around and send out surveys to try to figure out who the people were that maybe need to be let go. But then the managers would all say, no, I've got full work to keep all these people busy. And they were able to hold on to all these people. And the taxpayers, and most of them don't know that they're paying big salaries to these people to sit around and do basically nothing.
Yeah. By the way, this isn't a problem that's unique to the government or to federal government. I mean, Twitter fired half its staff. Did you notice? I didn't notice anything. Meta fired 12,000 people 2 years in a row. Didn't have any effect on my life. And we use these apps for like marketing and production and stuff. It made no difference to me. But the difference is that private companies or even publicly traded ones that are managed by actual human beings and not lizard people can just be like, you know what, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders or to the company itself, so we're not going to keep around a bunch of shiftless layabouts. whereas the government has no fiduciary responsibility to the people. There's nothing codified in any law in our Constitution or any law since that says that the government has a fiduciary responsibility to the people. And that seems like a good idea. I know Republicans back in the day were kind of trying to push for a constitutional amendment that required a balanced budget, right? Now, that's never going to happen because they don't want it to happen, not now either, so it'll never happen. I wonder from your perspective, can you name, because you worked in government, can you name Republicans that are actively trying to shrink the size of government? Because the Republicans of my era, I graduated high school in 99, my military service was in 2005 to 10. They've all been neocons. They presided over the largest expansion of the federal government history by a wide margin. It's not even close, percentage-wise and total number-wise. They voted for the Patriot Act, which expanded the security state in America. Warrantless spying on Americans that continues to this day. As a matter of fact, they just expanded it. And Republicans didn't seem to have a problem with that. They voted for TARP, 2 wars that spanned 20 years, so on and so on. What Republicans in office, because I can only think of 2 off the top of my head, are actually trying to shrink the size of the federal government?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And yeah, I mean, we had the Tea Party that came in for a bit and did make some progress in 2010, but you're right. For the most part, they've been willing to go along. That was, I think, one of the biggest disappointments of the Trump years was that ultimately the Republicans were willing to go along with the Democrats on big government, and they got more spending for defense, which I think the best way to the thing the federal government's best at is defense. So if you're going to spend money, that's probably where you do it. But yeah, it's a problem. It's one that, and I'm a big fan of term limits because I think these members of Congress get too cozy when they come to D.C. and the special interests woo them. They're getting money from all these different people who want the government to spend more money. So I would support term limits. I think also campaign finance regulations because these people, I mean, clearly if they're getting money from these special interest groups, they're going to vote for these groups and to give them more money.
Sure. But the question was about specific politicians. Do you know any that are actively trying to do it? Because, I mean, and maybe we don't know because let's be frank, most Republicans don't want to shrink the size of government. They just don't because their constituents are making money off of it, and that's what gets them elected. So the only 2 I can think of are Thomas Massie and Rand Paul, frankly, that are even trying to do this. Now, Justin Amash is running for Senate in your state. You're in Michigan. You said you're in Michigan, right?
Yes.
Yeah, he's running for Senate up there. We'll see how he does. But for the most part, it seems like there isn't a whole lot of even discussion about that sort of thing. It's just like how much money are we going to spend, right? Not should we even be spending money in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think I mean you do hear a lot of the Republicans paying lip service, but I think you're right. There's very few. I mean, Massey and Paul are probably the only ones I can think of as well, and that is something voters should be pushing on their representatives. I think at the moment, people are focusing more on the border. Border's going to take some more money. I'm not sure that it's going to take that much more. A lot of it's simply enforcing existing orders, getting the economy turned around. But again, I don't think you need to be spending a lot of money. We've seen the Democrats push all these stimulus bills, pour up huge amounts of money. Obama did it, and then Biden did it, and it really didn't have much effect on the economy. So the Republicans certainly should be getting back to the party of limited government and less spending. But yeah, right now it doesn't seem like there's a lot of indications that they're heading that way.
Okay. Well, that's pretty much what I think as well, unfortunately. But and I don't think I like Trump is not a typical old school conservative. As a matter of fact, he's more of a Democrat, like an old school 1990s Democrat, to be honest. Which is whatever. That's not necessarily a critique of him. It just is what it is. But he doesn't. I don't think it can. Certainly, he wants or is intimated that he would like to shut down some federal agencies or revamp them because of their behavior, but not because of the spending, right?
Yeah, I think that's uh, a fair assessment, and that is, I mean, that's another thing too, which I think Trump the first time was talking about draining this swamp, which much needs to be drained, but unfortunately, in the first time around, he did not appoint people to run the agencies of the sort you would really need. He put in a lot of establishment figures who really weren't interested in draining the swamp. Now, I know this time around there's initiatives underway at several places to try to identify in advance people who are actually going to take this mantra seriously. And so, I mean, there's a number of aspects to draining the swamp. Getting rid of corruption is a big one, but shrinking things down to size is certainly important. So, I do think there is some room to reduce the size of government. Though again, Congress, ultimately holds the strings, and my agency, the Agency for International Development, the Trump administration was proposing a pretty significant cut in their budget, but Congress, including some Republicans, decided they were going to keep it at existing levels. And again, a lot of that's because they were getting support from various lobbying organizations to keep spending.
Yeah, interesting. So let's get back to your work over at USAID. USAID was pretty, in my opinion, pretty instrumental during the Cold War. And the three phases: containment, détente, and rollback, especially in the rollback period. For those not familiar with the Cold War, containment is trying to fight micro wars everywhere to stop the spread of communism. Détente is a cooling off period, or however you want to define that. And rollback is essentially economic warfare, where we realize the Soviet Union was not capable of keeping up with us economically, so we just outspent them into the grave, right? We just bankrupted them, basically, like having the big pot in a Texas Hold'em game. You can just beat everybody after that, right? There's nothing anybody could really do. It seems like, at least for everybody except for China, and maybe even China, we could do that right now, but I don't hear a lot about that anymore. I've got quite a few friends in the State Department and the agency, and the State Department, agency, and USAID. This used to be like one of the primary things that they did, which is conduct soft economic warfare against other countries, right? Like we establish pipelines of minerals to come here so we can refine whatever, create jobs, make the products we need. Like there's no way we should be depending on Taiwan still for microprocessors. That is absolutely insane. I'm sure you remember 2020 through 20, man, really it was like late 2021 where there's this like fields of trucks that had no computer chips in them, so they couldn't sell them. They were just sitting in lots everywhere. Like we can't let that happen. I wonder from your perspective, is that or from your experience rather, is that something that's kind of coming back into focus for these guys? Because I've heard some of my agency friends have been talking quite a bit about economic warfare lately.
Yes, well, I personally think we should be engaged in economic warfare, especially against China. Now, this is another area where you run into problems with the global elites, including in our country. You have on Wall Street and also in Washington, lots of people who are profiting from the American trade with China, and so they don't want any part of harming China and its business interests. Again, I think these people have kind of lost touch with reality and the fact that we are a great nation. China is a dictatorship with a lot of malign ambitions, and it doesn't make sense for us to be hollowing out our industry so that we can have things done in China and we save a few cents when we go to Walmart. So there's a lot that can be done, and there have been efforts, and there are people who spend a lot of time on this issue who have plans for how we can undermine, especially these Chinese state-owned enterprises, because these aren't really private businesses. They're controlled by the Chinese state, and their objective is to supplant the United States as the world's most important power. And we're going to pay a hefty price, and could even at some point lead to war. So yes, I agree. We need to be thinking a lot more about economic warfare, and that is one area where I think the Republicans have an advantage because they're more interested in doing that. Although we have seen, we've seen Biden continue some of Trump's policies, but we also know that Biden and his family received large sums of money from various Chinese people who were trying to buy influence in the United States.
What do you think about Trump's suggestion? And to be honest, like I could tell that he's talking to libertarians now, like Vivek Ramaswamy and some other people, by the fact that he made this statement, specifically the specific words he's used, because I've heard them say them in person before. But what do you think about Trump's suggestion that he would attempt to eliminate the income tax and return us to a tariff tax system, which is what we had before? We unconstitutionally started taxing everybody's income in the early part of the 20th century.
Well, I think you would need to uh, change a whole bunch of minds in Congress, and I just don't see. Certainly, the Democrats wouldn't go along with that, and I think a lot of Republicans would be averse to that as well. And you know, if you were to do that, then you'd probably need to make big cuts to the government, which again, a lot of these people don't want. And the Republicans haven't been good in general in getting much past even things of a more modest nature. So to try to get something as big as that through, I don't think there's much likelihood that will happen.
So the president has a lot of power, obviously not in passing bills, but if money gets sent to a particular executive branch agency, if it's not specifically earmarked for something, the president has the ability to say exactly what that money can and can't be used for, frankly, right? Does the president have any power to curtail government spending at all in that regard? Could he say, well, we're going to create a rainy day fund with this money, or we're going to we're going to spend it on I know we've tried. I think at some point during his presidency, he tried to use spending from another agency to secure the border or something like that, and that got shot down. But does the president have any actual power in this regard?
Now, not really. Our agency, most of the money that came from Congress was earmarked, so there actually wasn't much discretion. And that little piece, I want to say 10% of the total that wasn't earmarked. There was a requirement to spend that. You couldn't just sit on it and not spend it. So, without congressional approval and support, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Now, hopefully, this next election, you'll get enough people who are sympathetic to Trump in the House and Senate that you can do more of these things. But certainly by himself, he's not going to be able to do this.
Is there any way to assign certain amounts of our national debt to the agencies that are spending that money? Because about 27% of our annual spending, which is about $6.5 trillion, is discretionary. 27%, right? So that means the president can technically say where to spend that money, but there's currently no debt assigned to anything. I think the debt is technically assigned to the defense budget, I think. So is there any way that the president could start assigning debt to individual agencies like that?
I don't believe so. I have not heard of something to that effect. He probably would have done it if they could.
Sure, yeah, you would think so, right? Well, let's get on to your book, because there's some stuff in here that I've never heard of before, and some alarming things as well. Like, I think we all know that multiple agencies in the Defense Department, the intelligence community, and the Department of Justice have been weaponized against any political opponent. I don't think it's political opponents. I think they want more wars. That's what I think. And Trump didn't start any, and they were fucking mad. That's what I think. And in addition to a lot of other things that were going on there. But give me the high notes. Give the audience the high notes of this book, because there's some wild stuff in here that I don't think people know about.
Yeah, well, I joined the Agency for International Development in 2018, and since you mentioned defense too, I should say I was expecting to go to the Department of Defense and I'd spent a lot of time doing military history, working at military institutions. But you had Secretary of Defense Mattis brought in, and Trump, as we know later, regretted that he brought Mattis in because Mattis wasn't really sympathetic to his viewpoint on a lot of issues and was too close to establishment figures. And one of his senior aides ended up getting implicated in this some questionable dealing over the Amazon Jedi contract. But so Mattis was going after what he claimed were apolitical political appointees. A lot of people that were brought in from the defense industry. And so it wasn't actually until 2020 that they brought in some other people who were more sympathetic to the president's point of view. So that's how I ended up at Agency for International Development. Early on, one of the first things that happened was that so I came into a bureau that had had no political appointees for more than a year. And so when I get there, they seem to have kind of forgotten that there's people here who are actually trying to implement what the president wants to do. So they mentioned at one meeting that they just been talking about humanitarian aid programs in Syria that were controversial, and they said that they had actually been trying to figure out ways to prevent the White House from knowing that the agency was doing this stuff in Syria, because if he found out, he might want to stop those programs. And so I reported that to my chain of command, and I was thinking they would probably do something. They ended up not doing any of it, and I still don't know the exact reason, but I think it was that we had other political appointees at our agency who were trying to get along with the bureaucrats and didn't want to ruffle too many feathers. So that was one of the first, real shocking things I saw. And then I took over an office after being there 6 months, and as soon as I got there, I was inundated with complaints about the people who had been running it before. The most serious of these was that one of these individuals was serving as the chairman of the board of a government contracting company while he was also a senior government official. And so I brought that to the attention of some human resources people. And now another disturbing thing they told me is they said, well, this stuff happens a lot, but most of the time the managers ignore it because they don't want to get upset people or get caught in some investigation. But I said, well, I didn't come here to tolerate corruption, so let's go ahead and do an investigation. So they investigate these various people. One of them, the most serious of them, is ultimately found to have been implicated in a criminal conflict of interest, but he then escapes punishment by going to the Department of Defense. And so this is another example of the things that make our government so toxic in many cases. The people, even if you try to hold them accountable, they can move over to some other part of the government. And so then this same individual who gets booted out of the agency goes and gets somebody to accuse me of publishing classified information in a book that I had published 2 years earlier. And that's a long story, which I won't go into all the detail, but I had given the government, I'd signed a non-disclosure agreement, gave them 30 days to review it. And they had taken much longer than that, and many, many months. They ended up having a whole year to review it, didn't do anything. And so 2 years later, though, then all of a sudden they come back and try to find fault with me. So this is another example of how the government tries to ignore the Constitution. I had a constitutional right to publish this after complying with the non-disclosure agreement, but they said, nope, we can make up bureaucratic rules, and our bureaucratic rule says you shouldn't have published this, even though you gave us the time. So they ended up using that to fire me, and they do that in conjunction with one of our political appointees. So I mentioned earlier, there was not careful selection of these people. So it turns out the number 2 political appointee at our agency, a woman named Bonnie Glick, she was married to the top lobbyist for our agency's contractors. Again, massive conflict of interest, never should have been allowed to happen. And so that's how I got fired. And then in process of all this, they were supposed to tell me supposedly what the offense was. They said, okay, you publish classified information. Um, I'm supposed to have the right to defend myself. My lawyer said, okay, well, tell us what the classified information is. And they then came up with every sort of excuse not to provide it. So I ended up suing them more than 2 years ago, and it's still in court. So more than 5 years ago, I was accused of publishing classified information, yet the government is refusing to actually produce any evidence. And I think the reason for that is primarily because they know this was a bogus allegation to begin with.
Good Lord. Well, I guess maybe it was a bad precedent to set that we had a man who was a congressman, and then the Secretary of Defense, and then a VP at Halliburton, and then the Vice President. Maybe that was a bad idea to go that route. I don't know. Maybe not. Who knows? Maybe the guy who did all the negotiation with the Middle East throughout the late 80s and 90s shouldn't have been the guy that was in charge of the Iran or the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war. You know, it just kind of it seems like all of this stuff has just been an apparatus to extract wealth from our population at this point. Like the all the political stuff and the terrorism stuff, it all seems like a canard to me. Like this is all just jingling keys. It's just magicians' patter so they can reach into our wallets and take our money away from us.
There is yeah, and I think you saw really after 9/11, you had this surge in government spending, and especially in the intel world, which is one part that doesn't get the attention it deserves. But if you talk to most people in the intel world, they'll say we spend a lot more than we need to spend on this. And so you've got a growing number of people who have a strong financial interest in these government agencies. And then you have government officials who move back and forth between the public sector and the private sector and are using those to enrich themselves. It's very troubling. I mean, I think one of the advantages you had with Trump is that he already had enough money that he didn't need to dabble in this sort of thing where we've seen a lot of other politicians leveraging both before and after office, using their government positions to finagle favors from these various groups. But it is, I think, disturbing. And again, something certainly American people, and when they think about who they send to Congress, they should think about the types of people they have, the degree of personal integrity, the degree to which they are going to be focusing on the interest of the voters as opposed to lining their own pockets.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, that's certainly something. It's really easy to get distracted in voting. We have a lot of single issue voters. You mentioned the abortion thing from the last election cycle, the last two really, but to some degree. But there are always more important things going on than the thing that matters most to us, probably, right? I mean, it's so from your perspective, how do we what can we do now to right the ship, and then even in addition to righting the ship to some degree, insulate ourselves from more of this, because it seems like we're going downhill faster and faster and faster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think getting people elected to office, and it's not just federal office, but state and local office. I mean, they have a lot to say too. I mean, people can get involved directly. I do think there's an opportunity for the Republicans to make some significant changes if they win both the presidency and both houses in the Congress. I don't think that they'll do everything we would want, but we've seen this current administration has just gone to tremendous excess. So the border is the most stunning example. But even if you could simply turn off everything this administration did, things would be quite a bit better, I think, for the American people. And so that's the message I would send to people.
And let's say Trump gets elected in 2024. What would your advice be to him?
Well, first would be to get the right people around him and get the right people in the cabinets running these agencies, because so often in the first administration, people weren't doing what he wanted. They were letting the bureaucrats run on autopilot, and that's a recipe for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so I would start with that and start with some executive orders, quickly overturning what Biden's worst policies, especially those on the border.
And what about cabinet positions? Do you have any favorites?
Uh, well, there's a lot of good people out there that he can draw from. I mean, if you look at, for example, you've got people like Tom Cotton, J.D. Vance. Well, these guys may also be considered for VP positions. But a lot of the people who they're looking at for VP positions, I think, would also make good cabinet officials. And I think certainly you want to be where. Well, Nikki Haley, for example, I think she is not. I think she's done. She was one of the big mistakes. People are still talking about her having a role, but yeah, I don't think we would want her. Yeah, it would be interesting to see if they find a role for Rand Paul in particularly one of these agencies that has especially high amount of bloat in it.
Yeah, I mean, Nikki Haley has no chance, I would hope. Jesus Christ. I mean, she's a horrible, horrible warmonger and has never been to war herself. So that's usually how that goes. Well, good. I mean, let's hope things go a little bit smoother this election cycle than they did the last one, because it was pretty chaotic. I don't recall. I mean, you and I have been around for a little while now, both following politics for a little while. I don't remember elections not being called the same night, except for ones that were extremely dubious, like the 2000 election and the Florida hanging Chad bullshit, and this last one in 2020. Mm-hmm. Those are the only two I remember where they weren't called that night in the history of this country. Actually, I believe. I think there may have been one other one way back in the day. Hopefully things will go a little bit better. I know the RNC has what they're calling an army of poll watchers and about 500 attorneys standing by to start suing people. So we'll see how it goes, I guess. Do you have any concerns about election integrity this year?
Yeah, I do think it's something to be watched. And I think the way that they're trying to have all these ways to vote not in person does open the door for abuse. Again, hopefully the margins will be sufficiently large that we won't have people arguing over this for days and even engaging in rioting. So, but it's certainly possible we could see another very close one, and which I think would not be good, just as it wasn't good the last time.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how it goes. Thanks for coming out today. We appreciate your time. Very interesting conversation. Make sure you guys check out the book, Masters of Corruption, How the Federal Bureaucracy Sabotaged the Trump Presidency. You heard one of the stories here, but there's a lot more information here. There's a lot of insane stuff in this book, so I highly recommend you getting it. It's on Amazon, audiobooks on Amazon. Go check it out. Thank you again for coming today. We really appreciate your time.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.